Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm William, 28 years old, and if you had told me a year ago that my own brother would steal from me and smirk about it to my face, I would have laughed it off. We weren't perfect siblings, but we'd been through a lot together: parents' divorce, years of moving around, the mess of college loans. I thought that sort of bond meant something. Turns out, it meant nothing to him. For most of my life, my brother Adam had a talent for landing on his feet no matter how bad he messed up. He'd quit jobs on impulse, crash at friends' houses, and somehow always find a way to make people feel bad for him. I used to call it Adam's charm, but looking back, it was manipulation in disguise. He knew exactly how to talk his way out of responsibility, and for years, I let him. I was the good one, the one who always helped, the one Mom bragged about for being responsible and level-headed. I didn't realize that reputation would make me an easy target. A few months ago, I started noticing small amounts missing from my checking account. At first, it was barely noticeable, 20 here, 40 there. I assumed it was one of those random app subscriptions I'd forgotten about. I even made a note to go through my transactions later, but kept putting it off. Work was busy, and I was juggling rent, bills, and trying to save up for a car repair. I didn't think much of it. Until one morning, I woke up to an overdraft alert. That alert hit me like a brick. I stared at my phone for a long time, convinced it had to be a mistake. I'd just been paid 2 days earlier. When I opened my banking app, the transactions didn't make sense. Several ATM withdrawals from a location near my old apartment. That was weird because I hadn't used that ATM in months. My first instinct was to call the bank, report fraud, and lock my card. But before I could, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. One of the withdrawals was made from the convenience store next to Adam's new place. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the ATM was just nearby. But deep down, I already knew. Adam had stayed with me for a couple of weeks back in the spring, until he found something stable, which meant until I had to remind him to pay for groceries and utilities. He had access to my place then. He knew where I kept my spare wallet, my bank card, my mail. I trusted him enough not to even consider that he might take something. But the more I looked at my statements, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. Someone had been draining me for months. I called the bank to freeze the account and request an investigation. The woman on the phone asked if I knew who might have access to my card information. I hesitated, then said the truth. My brother might. Saying it out loud felt strange, like I was betraying someone, but at the same time, I was furious. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the violation of trust. That night, I went over to Adam's apartment. It wasn't far from mine, just a few blocks away. He'd been living there for 2 months, supposedly after getting back on his feet. When I arrived, he greeted me with that lazy grin he always wore, like he had life figured out. "Will, what's up, man? You look tense," he said, leaning against the doorframe with a drink in hand. I didn't bother sitting down. "Adam, I need to ask you something. Did you take money from my account?" His grin didn't fade, it widened. "That's a pretty wild accusation, bro. Why would I do that?" "Because," I said, holding up my phone, "there are withdrawals from the ATM near your place. Multiple. Over the last few months." He shrugged like it was nothing. "So, maybe you used that ATM before." "I haven't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "And the timestamps match days you were with me, or when you borrowed my keys." For a second, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, but it vanished. He set his drink down and crossed his arms. "You're seriously accusing me of stealing from you? Your own brother? Wow, man. That's low." I almost wanted to believe him. But the smirk, the one that crept back onto his face when he saw I wasn't backing down, killed whatever doubt I had left. It wasn't a nervous smirk. It was a smug, knowing one, the kind you give when you realize the other person can't prove anything. "Just admit it, Adam," I said quietly. "How much did you take?" He didn't answer. He just tilted his head and said, "You really need to relax. It's not like you're broke." That sentence hit me harder than the missing money. Not because of what he said, but because of how casually he said it. Like taking from me was justified, like I owed him something. I walked out before I said something I'd regret. The next morning, I tried to file a police report, but without concrete proof, like security footage or a confession, they couldn't do much. The officer said, If you can confirm it was him on those withdrawals, we can move forward. But since Adam had used my old card and PIN, the transactions looked authorized. It was technically theft, but proving it would take time. Meanwhile, my landlord called. I rented a small duplex, and Adam had stayed in the other unit briefly before moving to his current place. My landlord, Mr. Harris, was a decent man in his 60s who didn't like drama. But his voice over the phone that day sounded tense. "William," he began carefully, "I wanted to let you know about your brother. He's been behind on rent, but because of some legal paperwork, I can't evict him just yet. He mentioned you might help cover it." My blood ran cold. "He told you that?" "Yes. He said you two share finances." I thought I should confirm before assuming anything. I thanked him for calling and assured him I wasn't paying a cent of Adam's rent. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Adam wasn't just stealing my money. He was dragging my name into his mess. That night, I met a few friends for dinner, still trying to calm down. I told them what had happened, hoping for a bit of validation. But instead, one of them sighed and said, "Will, it's family. Maybe just let it go. It's not worth losing your brother over money." That phrase, "let it go," set something off in me. Let it go? My savings were gone. My brother had been lying, stealing, and now he was using my name to dodge eviction. I didn't argue, though. I just nodded, pretending to agree. But inside, something shifted. For most of my life, I'd been the one keeping the peace. The responsible one. The one who cleaned up the mess. But that night, as I sat there listening to my friends talk about forgiveness, I decided I was done playing that role. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I just smiled, paid my part of the bill, and quietly started forming a plan. Because Adam had no idea who he was dealing with when he decided to steal from me. The days after that dinner were some of the longest I can remember. I went through my routines like normal, work, errands, gym, but my mind kept circling back to Adam. Every time I thought about him lounging on his couch, drinking cheap beer bought with my money, my stomach twisted. The smirk he'd given me during that confrontation was seared into my brain. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even sorry. He thought he'd gotten away with it. For a while, I told myself to stay calm, to let the bank investigation do its thing. But then more odd things started happening. Small at first, easy to miss, but they built up like pressure in a pipe. A week after that dinner, I went to pay my rent online, and the payment bounced back with a notice, pending account review. I called the property office, confused, and the clerk said, "Mr. Harris put a temporary hold on your payment. He said you might be transferring to another unit." I froze. "Transferring? I'm not moving." She sounded just as confused. "That's what we thought. But your brother told him you'd be switching units, and he was staying in yours. Something about you wanting to downsize." For a second, I couldn't speak. Adam had actually told my landlord I was moving out from my own unit. After I hung up, I drove straight to Mr. Harris's office. The man looked tired when I arrived, sitting behind his worn-out desk with folders stacked in uneven piles. "William," he said, rubbing his temples, "I'm glad you came by. I've been trying to reach you. Your brother's been persistent." "Persistent how?" He exhaled. "He came by twice last week. Said he was helping you with the move. Told me you authorized him to take over the lease on your place. He even offered to pay the deposit, though he didn't have the full amount." I almost laughed from disbelief. "You didn't believe him, right?" "I didn't sign anything," he assured me. "But I'll be honest, he's convincing. Said you got a new job and we're relocating. I figured I'd check with you before doing anything official." That was Adam's trick, half lies mixed with charm. He knew how to sound confident, casual, even friendly, all while spinning a web. I thanked Mr. Harris for holding off and promised I'd take care of it personally. By the time I got back to my car, my hands were shaking again. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Adam was crossing into my life, my home, my reputation. He wanted to take over what little security I had, and I couldn't ignore that. I tried calling him, no answer. Texted him, nothing. Hours later, I got a single message, "Relax, bro. It's not that deep." Not that deep. He'd stolen from me, lied to my landlord, and now was pretending it was no big deal. My patience cracked that night. Still, I held off doing anything drastic. I told myself I needed a clear head, but fate had other plans. The following weekend, I went out for groceries. When I got back, I noticed something off about my apartment door. The lock wasn't broken, but it felt different, like someone had been inside. My gut told me to check everything. And sure enough, drawers were slightly ajar, mail scattered on the table, my spare car keys missing. I didn't even need to think about it. I drove straight to Adam's place. When I knocked, he opened the door halfway, eyes half-lidded like he'd just woken up. "Oh, it's you," he muttered. "Where are my keys, Adam?" He blinked. "What keys?" "My spare car keys. And my mail. Did you go into my apartment?" "Why would I do that?" he said, smirking again. "Maybe you just misplaced them." I stepped forward, but he blocked the doorway, leaning on the frame like he was enjoying the show. "You're being paranoid, Will. Seriously, man, chill out." Something in me snapped. "You're crossing a line. If you step into my apartment again, I'll report you for trespassing." He tilted his head, voice dropping into that mocking tone he always used when he wanted to make me feel small. "You really think anyone's going to take your word over mine? You've always been so uptight. Maybe you should loosen up a bit." I left before I did something I'd regret, but as I was walking away, I heard him call out, "Don't forget to lock your door next time." That was it. The final straw. The next few days were tense. I barely slept. Every sound at night made me think he was outside again. My landlord confirmed he'd seen Adam wandering near my unit, checking something about the mailbox. I called the police to file a report about possible unauthorized entry, but without proof, they could only warn him to stay away. The officer who came by even asked, "Are you sure he doesn't have a key?" That question stuck with me, because, technically, he did. Months ago, when he'd stayed with me, I'd given him a spare. I'd forgotten all about it. I changed the locks the next day. That same evening, I saw Adam waiting by my car. He smiled when I approached, leaning casually against the hood. "So you changed the locks." "Harsh. You broke into my place," I said quietly. He shrugged. "I just needed a few things. You weren't home. What's the big deal?" "The big deal," I said, trying to stay calm, "is that you've been stealing from me for months. You've lied to my landlord. You've saved you from being boring?" He interrupted, smirking. "You act like this is some huge betrayal. It's just money. You'll make more. You always do." His words sliced through me. It wasn't the first time he'd dismissed me like that, as if all my effort, all my work, meant nothing because I was the stable one. But something about the way he said it this time, it was different. Then he reached into his pocket and dangled my spare keys in front of me. "Looking for these?" I froze. "Give them to me." He smiled. "Nah, you'll get them back when I feel like it." I don't remember deciding to grab them. My body just moved. I snatched the keys out of his hand, and for a brief second, his expression changed. That smirk faltered. It wasn't fear, though, it was anger. Real, raw anger. "You think you're better than me," he said, voice low. "Always have. Just because you have a job, a car, and some savings. You think that makes you superior?" "I think it means I take responsibility for my life," I shot back. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You don't get it, Will. Everything you have, you only got because I let you. Mom always liked you because you were the good son. I'm the one who messed up, right? So you get the praise, and I get the scraps. You think that's fair?" For a moment, I didn't recognize him. His face twisted with resentment I hadn't seen before, like he'd been holding it in for years, waiting for the right time to unleash it. "This isn't about Mom," I said quietly. "This is about you stealing from me." But he wasn't listening anymore. He stepped back, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. I didn't stop him. Later that night, I got a call from Mr. Harris. His tone was cautious. "William, I'm sorry to bother you again, but your brother came by this afternoon. He said you gave him permission to store some things in your garage." I told him no, but he got upset. Said you'd changed. I felt my heart sink. Adam wasn't just lying anymore. He was building a narrative, painting himself as the victim and me as the cold, selfish brother. The next morning, when I went to my car, I found the driver's side mirror smashed. No note. No witnesses. Just a small dent in the door and a cracked mirror. The security camera near the lot wasn't working, according to Mr. Harris. I didn't even bother calling the police this time. When I told my friends, their responses were almost identical. "He's clearly jealous, Will. Don't let him get to you." And then, the one that always made my jaw tighten, "Your family. Maybe just let it go. Let it go." Those words again. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. But I felt something inside me harden, A quiet, cold resolve. Because what everyone else didn't understand was that Adam wasn't going to stop. People like him didn't just get better. They kept taking until you took something back. And I had finally reached the point where I was ready to take something back. It happened 2 nights later. I was leaving work late when I got a call from my landlord again. His voice was tight with concern. "William," he said, "I'm at your unit right now. There's a situation." My chest tightened. "What kind of situation?" "Your brother's here. He's inside your apartment." I didn't even hang up properly. I drove home so fast I barely remember the trip. When I arrived, the front door was open, lights on. Mr. Harris stood outside with 2 neighbors watching from a distance. Inside, Adam was sitting on my couch, feet propped up on my coffee table, flipping through my mail. My drawers were open again, my belongings scattered everywhere. "Hey, Will," he said calmly, not even surprised to see me. I needed a place to crash. I just stood there, speechless, as everything clicked. The stolen money, the lies, the manipulation, it all led here. This was his plan all along. To take over what was mine, bit by bit, until I had nothing left. That night, standing in the doorway of my own apartment, I realized just how far things had fallen. Adam didn't even flinch when I told him to leave. He just leaned back against my couch like he owned the place, flipping through my personal mail as if he was reading a magazine. Mr. Harris stood quietly behind me, torn between wanting to step in and not wanting to get dragged into the middle of family business. I said his name once, calmly, then again louder. "Adam, get out." He didn't even look up. "Relax, man. It's temporary. I'll be gone in a few days." "You're already trespassing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out before I call the police." He finally looked up then, eyes narrowing. "You'd really call the cops on your own brother?" It was a loaded question, one designed to make me hesitate. And it worked for a moment. Calling the police on him would feel like crossing a line, something you couldn't come back from. But then I looked around, my drawers open, my paperwork scattered, my privacy violated, and something inside me shifted. "Yes," I said quietly. "I would." His expression darkened. "Unbelievable," he muttered, standing up. "After everything I've done for you." That line almost made me laugh. I wanted to ask him what, exactly, he thought he'd done for me, but I didn't. I just stood there until he finally stormed out, muttering under his breath the whole way. After he left, Mr. Harris helped me check the apartment. Nothing was missing that I could confirm, but everything felt tainted. The place didn't feel like home anymore. It felt invaded. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smirk again. The next morning, I called the police and filed another report. This time, I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them about the money, the break-ins, the threats. The officer took notes but said, again, that without proof, it would be difficult to press charges. I asked if I could file a restraining order. He said it was possible, but would take time and documentation. It felt like shouting into a void. In the weeks that followed, I started to unravel. My sleep was a mess, my appetite disappeared, and my focus at work crumbled. My manager noticed, asking if I needed time off. I told him no, but inside I was drowning. Adam was quiet for a while, too quiet. No calls, no texts, no run-ins. I should have felt relief, but instead, I felt tension, like I was waiting for the next disaster. And it came soon enough. One morning, I got an email from my bank's fraud department. A new credit card had been opened under my name, an account I never authorized. Thousands of dollars had already been charged. The purchases were mostly electronics and gaming equipment, all shipped to an address I recognized immediately, Adam's old apartment. I spent hours on the phone with the bank, canceling accounts, disputing charges, changing passwords. When I called the credit bureau, they confirmed that my social security number had been used for multiple recent applications. It wasn't just theft anymore, it was identity fraud. I remember sitting at my desk afterward, head in my hands, feeling hollow. He hadn't just taken money. He'd taken me. My name, my credit, my security, everything that defined the stable life I'd built. That week, I got a notice from my landlord saying the lease renewal was being delayed pending documentation review. I knew what that meant. Adam had probably tried something again. My friends, when I told them, said the same thing they always did. He's your brother, Will. Maybe he needs help. Help. That word had become meaningless to me. I'd given him help all my life. Help had turned into excuses. I hit rock bottom about 2 months later when I received a call from my employer's HR department. They'd been contacted by a credit verification agency regarding an active debt inquiry. My brother had apparently used my information to apply for a small business loan and listed my workplace as an income verifier. The humiliation was almost worse than the damage. Having to explain to HR that my own brother was using my identity felt like peeling back the last layer of dignity I had left. After that, I finally took time off work. My boss approved a short leave, saying, "Handle whatever you need to handle well. Just take care of yourself." It was during those weeks off that something unexpected happened. I started realizing how much of my life had revolved around reacting to Adam, fixing his messes, defending him, worrying about him. Even now, when he wasn't physically around, he was controlling my every thought. One morning, after another sleepless night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook and made a list. On one side, I wrote everything Adam had taken or ruined: money, time, peace of mind, trust. On the other, I wrote everything I still had: my job, my skills, my friends, however misguided, and my determination. That list became the start of something new. The first thing I did was close every single shared account I'd ever had, even old ones. I filed a report with the Federal Trade Commission, contacted a legal aid organization, and began the process of repairing my credit. It was tedious, exhausting work, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something for me, not just reacting to him. I started spending more time alone, not in a lonely way, but in a rebuilding way. I'd walk in the evenings, clear my head, and come home to read or plan. I picked up freelance work on weekends, graphic design, small projects, stuff that reminded me I had value outside of the chaos Adam had caused. Slowly, money started coming in again. And then something changed internally, something subtle but powerful. I stopped explaining myself. When friends asked how things were going with Adam, I didn't defend him or say I hoped he'd get better. I just said, "He's out of my life." And I meant it. The next time he tried contacting me, I didn't answer. He called from new numbers, sent emails pretending to apologize, even left a note under my door that said, "We're still family." I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I handed everything to my lawyer, the one I'd finally hired after scraping together enough money. I started keeping records of everything: timestamps, emails, messages, account changes. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. I'd been helpless for too long, and now, piece by piece, I was reclaiming my power. It took a few months, but I got my finances stable again. I fixed my credit. I moved into a new apartment on the other side of town. No shared addresses, no traces of Adam. I got a new car, too, modest but reliable. And slowly, I started feeling like myself again. There were still bad days. Nights when I'd wake up thinking I heard someone at the door, or mornings when I'd check my bank account with my heart racing. But each time I found everything untouched, I'd feel a small wave of relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The best part, though, was how much stronger I felt. I'd stopped seeing myself as the responsible older brother, whose job it was to fix everything. I started seeing myself as someone who deserved peace. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes, I found a photo of Adam and me as kids. We were sitting on the steps of our old house, grinning with popsicles in hand. For a moment, I felt that old tug of nostalgia, the part of me that wanted to believe he could still change. But then I looked closer at his expression. Even as kids, there was a certain look in his eyes. Not mischief, not innocence, entitlement. And I realized that I had spent my entire life mistaking entitlement for charm. That night, I wrote a short email to my landlord, thanking him for everything he'd done during that mess. He replied the next morning, "Glad to see you're doing well. Well, you deserve a fresh start." Those words stayed with me. I'd started rebuilding my career, taking on bigger freelance contracts, and earning enough to consider starting my own small business. The irony wasn't lost on me. Adam had tried to ruin my name by applying for a business loan in my identity, and here I was, planning to open one legitimately. I called it Step 1, because that's what it felt like, my first real step towards something that belonged only to me. Still, even with my life stabilizing, I couldn't shake one lingering thought. Adam was out there, and he hadn't faced any consequences. Not yet. The authorities were still processing the reports, but these things took time. Months, maybe longer. But I wasn't rushing anymore. For the first time, patience was on my side. The more I worked, the more confident I became. My savings grew. My business took off slowly but steadily, and I began to build connections with clients who appreciated my reliability, the same trait Adam used to mock me for. And then one evening, after a long day of work, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. Hello. There was a pause, then a familiar voice. Will, it's me, Adam. I didn't say anything. I know you're mad, he said, but I need your help. Those words, I need your help, used to trigger guilt in me. But this time, they only made me feel calm. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the window, the city lights flickering outside. You should probably call someone else, I said quietly. I don't have anyone else, he said, voice shaky now. Please, Will. I messed up. Bad. I said nothing. Just hear me out, he pleaded. It's about the money. The people I owe, they know where you live. That was when I realized the storm wasn't over yet. By the time summer rolled around, I had officially cut my brother out of my life, at least emotionally. The bank finally refunded most of what he stole after I filed a police report, but they couldn't recover everything. Still, the money wasn't the real loss. The real loss was the trust. The kind of quiet, invisible thread that connects siblings even when they're different. Once that snapped, I realized how long I'd been trying to keep something alive that was already dead. After everything fell apart, I focused on rebuilding. I moved to a smaller apartment in a different part of town, closer to my job. I found peace in the simplest things, the sound of the kettle in the morning, the silence when I closed the door after work, the absence of chaos. I stopped checking my phone in dread, waiting for the next crisis from David. No more guilt-tripping calls from Mom telling me to understand your brother's struggles. No more emergency transfers that left me eating ramen for the rest of the month. It took time, but I started to feel lighter. I got a promotion at work, something small but steady, and began saving properly this time, under my name alone. I even treated myself to new furniture, a second-hand couch, a bookshelf, a small desk. Each item felt like a brick in a foundation I was building from scratch. I wasn't trying to create a life that looked impressive. I just wanted one that was mine. But peace is fragile when you come from a family like mine. It doesn't last long before someone finds a way to break it. It started with the first text in months from my mom. We need to talk about David. He's not doing well. I stared at my screen for a long time before typing back. I'm not getting involved. Her reply came instantly. You're still his brother, William. You can't just abandon family. I didn't respond. Because yes, I could. Over the next few weeks, I ignored the calls, the guilt-tripping, the endless parade of messages about how David wasn't himself and just needed a bit of help getting back on his feet. I knew exactly what that meant, money. The kind of help that came straight from my account, never to be returned. But then something happened that made my blood boil. One morning, I got a letter from my landlord at my old building, the one I'd left after everything blew up. It said I still owed $1,200 in damages. Apparently, someone had broken into the apartment after I moved out and used my name on the contact form with the building management. The name listed on the form was David Collins, my brother. When I called the building office, they said they couldn't evict the tenant because he'd already claimed to be my co-leaseholder. I felt the floor drop under me. How long has he been there? I asked, my voice trembling. About 2 months, the landlord said calmly. He said you gave him permission to stay until the end of your lease. But since your name is still on the original contract, you're technically responsible until this is resolved. My chest felt tight. You can't evict him yet. Not until we verify everything, he said. But I recommend you speak to him directly. He's not being cooperative. The worst part? The landlord didn't sound surprised. That told me everything I needed to know. David had likely been causing problems there already. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the old apartment address printed on the letter. It was like staring at a ghost. I thought I was done with that chapter, but somehow he'd managed to pull me back in. My first instinct was anger, the kind that burns cold instead of hot. Then, as it always did with David, it turned into something else, determination. He had taken from me once. But this time, he'd crossed a line that even my parents couldn't defend. I wasn't just dealing with stolen money. This was identity theft. Fraud. Still, I didn't want to explode. Not yet. If there was one thing the past year had taught me, it was that revenge worked best when you were quiet about it. So, I started to prepare. First, I reached out to a lawyer, not to sue, but to understand what I could and couldn't do. The lawyer explained my options carefully. I could file a police report again, present proof of fraud, and notify the property management that I had already vacated. But when I told him who the person was, my brother, he gave me a look that said he'd heard this story too many times before. Family makes it complicated, he said gently. But documentation is your best friend here. Don't confront him yet. Gather everything. So I did. I spent the next week collecting screenshots of messages, bank statements, and even the lease termination email from months ago. I organized everything into folders on my laptop labeled with dates. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. David hadn't just used my name to get into the apartment. He had listed me as a reference for 2 other applications, both of which had been rejected. That explained why I'd been getting strange emails from rental agencies. It became clear that David was spiraling, but that didn't excuse what he'd done. Then, just as I was wrapping my head around all of this, he showed up. I was leaving work one evening when I saw him standing outside the building, leaning against the railing like he owned the place. He looked thinner, unshaven, and smug. That same smirk I remembered, the one that always made me feel like I was the crazy one for caring about consequences. "Hey, Will," he said casually, as if we'd just run into each other by coincidence. "You've been hard to reach." I clenched my jaw. "You broke into my old apartment." He shrugged. "Didn't break in. Just used what was available. You weren't using it anymore." "That's fraud," I said flatly. "Come on," he laughed. "You act like it's a big deal. It's not like I trashed the place. I'm paying rent now." "With whose money?" I asked. His smirk widened. "Wouldn't you like to know?" That was when I realized something. He wasn't scared. He didn't even think he'd done anything wrong. And that was more dangerous than I expected. I walked away before I said something I'd regret. But inside, something shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. That night, I stayed up late researching how to build a legal paper trail. I reported the fraud, filed a notice with the bank and property office, and informed the credit bureau to flag my name for unauthorized use. Then I set a meeting with the landlord to go over the evidence. When I told my parents what had happened, they reacted exactly as I expected. Mom sighed. "He's struggling, William. You're his older brother. Can't you just let him stay until he finds somewhere else?" "Do you even hear yourself?" I said quietly. "He stole my identity." Dad chimed in, his tone stern but dismissive. "He's family. We handle things privately." "Privately?" I repeated. "You mean I let him get away with it again?" The silence that followed told me everything. They weren't going to change. So, I stopped trying to convince them. I started working in silence, gathering, documenting, preparing. The same way I had rebuilt my life, brick by brick. A few days later, I met with the landlord. I showed him the paperwork, the police report, the messages. He nodded slowly as he flipped through the pages. "All right," he said finally. "We'll start the eviction process. But we'll need your statement to move forward." "I'll give it," I said, "and I'll handle the rest." As I walked out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. David had always played on chaos. He thrived when I reacted, when I lost my cool, when I begged or yelled or tried to reason. But now I was calm, and that scared him more than anything. In the following weeks, I kept my distance but kept tabs. Through a few mutual acquaintances, I learned that David was bragging about how he'd outsmarted me again, saying I was too soft to do anything real. He had no idea what was coming. Because this time, I wasn't just going to protect myself. I was going to make sure he never had the chance to do this to anyone else again. The first official eviction notice went out in early September. I didn't tell my family. I didn't warn David. I didn't even mention it to my coworkers who'd seen me unravel months ago. This time, my silence was my strategy. Every piece of paper, every form, every notarized signature was part of a plan that would finally make him face what he'd spent his entire life running from: accountability. When the notice was served, I got a call from the landlord. "He's refusing to leave," he said, frustration sharp in his voice. "He claims you're handling the rent." I smiled faintly. "Then let him tell that to the court. I've already provided proof he's not on the lease." For weeks, Things were quiet, too quiet. My parents didn't know what was happening, but I suspected David had gone running to them. Sure enough, I got a call from Mom one Sunday morning, her tone accusatory before I'd even said hello. "How could you do this to your brother?" she said. "He told us you're trying to have him thrown out on the street." "Because he's squatting in an apartment that's still in my name," I said evenly. "You're overreacting," she snapped. "He just needs time." Time for what? To ruin my credit again? To keep using my name until I have nothing left? "William," she said with that sigh that had always meant the conversation was over when she wanted it to be, "you've always been so rigid. Family isn't about rules. It's about helping each other." "No," I said quietly. "It's about respect." And he lost that when he stole from me. I hung up before she could continue. My hands were shaking, but not from guilt. This time, it was from relief. I'd spent most of my life being the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who smoothed things over so everyone else could stay comfortable. But peace built on silence wasn't real peace. It was submission. That week, I followed every legal step meticulously. I made sure the property manager had copies of every document proving I'd terminated my lease months earlier. The court acknowledged the fraud claim, and I filed an identity theft report with the police. David tried calling me 7 times in one day, but I didn't answer. He left a single voicemail that started calm and ended angry. "You're making a mistake, Will. You think you're smart, but you don't know who you're messing with. I'll tell Mom and Dad everything. They'll take my side like they always do." He wasn't wrong about that last part, but I didn't need their support anymore. 2 weeks later, the eviction was executed. David was officially removed from the apartment by court order. The landlord called afterward, sounding both relieved and exhausted. "He left a mess behind," he said. "But it's over." Over. That word echoed in my head long after I hung up. But my revenge wasn't about seeing him evicted. It was about exposing the pattern, the one no one in my family wanted to acknowledge. After the eviction, I filed a fraud alert on all my credit accounts and made sure his name was flagged wherever possible. I even sent a copy of the report to my parents' address, not to gloat, but to show them the proof they'd spent years ignoring. A few days later, I got an email from my mom. Short, cold, and typed in a way that made her guilt sound like accusation. "You've embarrassed this family. You could have handled this privately. Your father is disappointed." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to explain. They weren't disappointed because of what David did. They were disappointed because I didn't let it slide. Still, karma has a funny way of arriving right on time. A month after the eviction, David's new roommate reached out to me. Apparently, he'd moved in with a guy from one of his odd jobs, someone he'd convinced to co-sign a rental application. When things started disappearing around the apartment, cash, tools, a watch, the roommate checked David's name online and found the eviction record. He kicked him out the same day. Word got around. David's reputation started catching up to him. The same smug confidence that once made him seem untouchable now made him radioactive. He couldn't hold a job longer than a few weeks, and every time he tried to use me as a reference, the employer would contact me first. I told the truth, calmly and without malice. I wouldn't recommend him. By winter, he'd burned every bridge. I wish I could say I took pleasure in it, but the truth is, it wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was closure. Watching him face the consequences didn't fill me with joy. It filled me with peace, the kind that comes when you finally put something heavy down after carrying it too long. But life wasn't done surprising me. One cold evening, just before Christmas, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, David stood there. He looked different, hollow-eyed, worn out, desperate. There was no smirk this time, just a man who had finally realized the weight of his own choices. "Can I come in?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Every part of me screamed to shut the door. But I stepped aside, letting him in, mostly because I wanted to hear what excuse he'd come up with now. He sat down quietly, hands clasped together. "I messed up," he said after a long silence. "I don't know what else to say. I thought I could fix things, but everything's gone wrong." "You thought using my name again was going to fix things?" He winced. "I didn't think it through. I just needed time. I thought you'd understand." "I did understand," I said. "For years. Every time you lied, I understood. Every time you took, I understood. I understood until it destroyed me." He looked down, his voice small. "So what now? You're just done?" "Yes," I said simply. "I'm done." He stared at the floor, nodding slowly. Then he stood, mumbling, "I guess I deserve that." As he reached the door, he turned back once more. "Mom and Dad think you're cruel," he said softly. "They think you've changed." "I have," I said. "I finally stopped letting you ruin my life." He didn't respond. He just left, closing the door behind him. That was the last time I saw him. A few months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he'd moved out of state. No one knew where. My parents rarely mentioned him anymore. When they did, it was in vague tones. "David's trying to get back on his feet," or "he's figuring things out." Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But by then, I had moved on too. The small apartment I'd once thought of as temporary became home. I filled it with plants, framed my own photography, and started volunteering at a local financial literacy group, helping others protect themselves from fraud, especially from people they trusted. Funny how life works like that. It's been 2 years since everything happened. My credit's clean. My savings are secure. And most importantly, I sleep soundly. Sometimes, when I walk past my old neighborhood, I think about the man I used to be, the one who'd bend over backward for everyone else just to avoid conflict. I don't hate him. I just wish he'd realized sooner that protecting yourself isn't cruelty. It's survival. As for David, I don't wish him harm. I just hope one day he realizes that every person he blamed, every bridge he burned, led him exactly where he is. Alone. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about destroying him. It was about reclaiming my peace and letting him face the world without a safety net made of my sacrifices. And that's exactly what I did. In the end, revenge didn't look like triumph. It looked like silence. A locked door. A full night's sleep. And a life finally lived without fear of the next call, the next theft, the next excuse. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't making them pay. It's making sure they never get the chance to take from you again. Hi Reddit. My name is Elijah. I'm 32, and I've spent most of my life trying to make peace with my family, only to realize peace isn't always possible when one side refuses to treat you like a human being. I've always known my dad had favorites, and my older brother, Ryan, was it. It's not just the typical firstborn gets more attention thing. It was more like Ryan could do no wrong, and I could do nothing right. Every achievement I had, every milestone I reached, was either ignored or used as a way to highlight how lacking I was compared to Ryan. Honestly, growing up, it hurt more than I could admit at the time. I internalized a lot of that resentment, but I learned to hide it because family dinners and holidays were minefields I didn't want to navigate with anger flashing across my face. I figured if I smiled and nodded, maybe one day they'd see me. Spoiler, they never did, at least not in the way I hoped. Now, I have a son, Liam, who's 7, and from the moment he was born, I made a promise to myself that he wouldn't grow up feeling like second best the way I did. My ex-wife and I share custody, and we've always tried to keep things light and joyful during our visits with family, but I couldn't ignore the red flags every time we went to my parents' house. I'd always hoped my dad had mellowed over the years, but deep down, I knew he hadn't. He just had a bigger platform to show it now, and I wasn't going to let it poison Liam's life. My birthday was last weekend, and normally, I'd skip celebrating at my parents' because, well, there's a lot of history there, but this year, I thought maybe I'd give it a shot. Maybe my dad had changed. Maybe my brother had matured. I should have known better, but I was tired of carrying my past like a burden that kept me from making moments with my own family. I wanted Liam to see family dinners as something joyful, not tense and loaded with judgment. The day started out innocently enough. My mom was bustling in the kitchen, talking about the cake she'd baked and the tiny party favors she'd set out for Liam. She smiled at me in that way that tried to make everything okay, like she knew the storm was coming but wanted to pretend it wasn't. Dad was already in the living room, wearing his serious face that always meant he was about to lecture or compare someone. Ryan arrived not long after, and from the moment he walked in, it was obvious the dynamic hadn't changed. He had his usual confident grin, the one that made it impossible for me not to feel invisible. He hugged my dad first, and they shared this long, private handshake that I could barely see, but I knew it was another layer of whatever secret ritual they had to solidify Ryan's superiority. I tried to stay relaxed for Liam's sake. He was happily playing with the little action figures my mom had set up for him on the coffee table. I could feel my dad watching me out of the corner of my eye, that look that said, without words, "I'm judging everything about you." I'd learned to ignore it most of the time, but I could feel the tension creeping up like an itch I couldn't scratch. Dinner was served, and everything seemed normal at first. Mom was humming, passing dishes around, and Ryan was making small talk about his work and investments. Then, the moment that made my stomach drop came when Dad stood up with a little flourish, clearing his throat like he was about to give a speech. I felt Liam sit up a little straighter, sensing the shift in energy even if he didn't understand why. My dad always loved dramatic gestures, and I was about to be reminded why. He started with Ryan, "Of course. We're so proud of you," he said, and the words were coated in this syrupy pride that made my teeth ache. Then he pulled out a small, velvet box from behind his back. I already knew what it was going to be. He handed it to Ryan, who opened it with wide eyes, and there it was, a $1,500 watch, gleaming under the dining room lights. Ryan looked ecstatic, hugging my dad and thanking him profusely. Everyone clapped politely, but I could feel my chest tighten. I glanced down at Liam, whose little hands were folded neatly on the table, and I saw the way he tilted his head, curious and excited, completely unaware of what was coming next. Then, Dad turned to us. And when I say us, I mean me and Liam, because Ryan had already been elevated to this untouchable pedestal. He looked at Liam and said, "You should learn to be content." Then, he handed him a cheap toy, some plastic trinket that barely made any sense as a gift. I could see Liam's face fall slightly, the joy dimming as he held up the tiny thing, confused but trying to smile. My stomach dropped. My own father, someone who should have been modeling fairness and love, had just publicly humiliated my son for no reason other than my existence as his other child. And I had to keep it together. I had to smile. For Liam. For both of us. So I smiled. I thanked Dad politely, even though I felt like my teeth were grinding together. I reached over, picked Liam up, and whispered, "Let's go check out your toy, buddy." We left the dining room quietly, and the moment we stepped into the hallway, I felt the tension release a little. Liam started fiddling with the toy, genuinely trying to enjoy it despite the awkwardness, and I let myself exhale. I didn't say a word on the way out to Dad, because sometimes silence is louder than shouting. I knew he would notice. He always noticed, but he had no idea how much he had just planted the seed of something that would grow far beyond his control. In the car, Liam chattered about the toy's superpowers and what he could do with it, completely unaware of the insult wrapped in it. I forced myself to laugh along, trying to make it light, but inside, I felt a simmering fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way Dad had looked at Ryan like he was flawless, the way he had looked at Liam like he needed a lesson in being content. I realized, with a sinking clarity, that this wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern that had existed for decades, and now, it was being passed on to my son. I spent the next couple of days thinking about how I wanted to handle it. I could call Dad out, but that would have been reactive, and I didn't want to stoop to his level. I wanted this to be about more than immediate confrontation. I wanted it to be strategic. I wanted him to understand, deeply, that the way he treated people, his children, had consequences, and he couldn't just play favorites and expect everyone to smile politely while he wielded his approval like a weapon. I knew, instinctively, that something had shifted that night. Something had awakened in me, a drive I hadn't felt in years. And then, a few days later, the call came. Dad's voice was shaky, cracking with something I hadn't heard before. Remorse, fear, maybe even a little desperation. "Elijah," he said, almost whispering, "we were wrong about you." My stomach sank. Part of me wanted to say, "Welcome to the real world." But another part of me was already forming the plan I'd been mulling over. I knew that call was the opening, not the resolution. The real confrontation, the real reckoning, was still ahead. I had to be smart, calm, and deliberate. And I was ready. After that birthday incident, I thought maybe things might calm down. That Dad's strange, teary phone call meant he was starting to realize how toxic his behavior had been. I wanted to believe it, really, but old habits die hard. The very next weekend, we went over for what my mom had called a family brunch. I should have known better. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, like it was already weighted with expectations and judgment before we even walked in the door. Liam clutched my hand, bouncing on his toes, oblivious to the storm brewing. I tried to stay lighthearted for him, but every step I took felt like walking into a minefield. Dad greeted us at the door with that same half-smile he's perfected over decades, the one that tries to hide superiority behind civility. "Elijah, good to see you," he said, but I could hear the faint edge of condescension. Ryan was already there, lounging on the couch, phone in hand, checking emails or stock updates, some high-powered business stuff that Dad seemed to hang on like gospel. "And this must be Liam," Dad said, looking down at my son, eyes flicking over him like he was scanning a product for defects. I could feel Liam stiffen, and I immediately squeezed his shoulder to reassure him. Dad didn't even try to hide the comparison in his gaze. Ryan, perfect and accomplished; Liam, small and, according to Dad's standards, insufficient. The brunch started with Dad telling stories about Ryan, how he had handled a tough negotiation at work or managed his portfolio like a pro, each anecdote punctuated with nods and smiles, as if to silently reinforce, "See, this is the kind of son worth celebrating." I tried to join in, mentioning a recent project at work that I'd actually been proud of. I could see Dad's face flicker with irritation as he interrupted. "That's nice, Elijah, but it's not quite like Ryan's achievements, is it?" I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile, and Liam tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Dad, why is Grandpa being mean?" My chest tightened. I reminded myself not to react. Not in front of Liam. I wanted him to see that sometimes adults act like children, and the only power we have is in how we respond. But inside, every word from Dad felt like a cut, and every glance at Ryan reinforced a lifetime of neglect and favoritism. My brother, oblivious as ever, lounged in comfort, basking in the glow of Dad's approval, occasionally adding a boast of his own that made my jaw clench. Then came the gift moment. I should have known. Dad, in his own dramatic way, pulled out another box, this time handing it to Ryan with an exaggerated flourish. Inside was a sleek leather briefcase, monogrammed, easily another $1,000 plus gift. Ryan's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. I could feel Liam's tiny hand slip into mine, hesitating as he watched the exchange, and I knew what was coming next. Sure enough, Dad turned to us with a tight-lipped smile. "And for Liam," he said, holding out a small, plastic toy helicopter, the kind you can get for $5 at a convenience store. I bit back a sharp retort, knelt down to Liam's level, and said, "It's really cool, buddy. Look at this rotor, spin it." Liam tried, his enthusiasm forced but genuine, and I could feel the burn of injustice simmering under my skin. I wanted to shout, to demand respect for my son, but I knew that yelling in that room wouldn't make anything better. It would just give Dad the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. The rest of the brunch was a blur. Dad continued his subtle digs, making offhand comments about my career choices, my lack of ambition, and my supposed failure to match up to Ryan. Ryan, for his part, laughed along, not maliciously, but smugly, like he was fully aware of the dynamic and enjoyed watching me squirm quietly under the weight of it. I kept my focus on Liam, trying to shield him from the negativity, but the tension was contagious. By the time we left, I felt like I had been slowly strangled by polite conversation. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Every family event, every phone call, every brief text exchange became another opportunity for Dad to pit us against each other, to reinforce Ryan as the prized son and Liam and I as the others who should quietly accept whatever crumbs were thrown our way. I started noticing that Ryan would casually mention plans that included Dad but not me, or Dad would make small comments like, "Elijah, maybe someday you'll understand how to manage your finances like Ryan," as if that was the ultimate measure of a man's worth. I could see the way Liam's shoulders drooped whenever Dad addressed him with the same dismissive tone, and it was breaking my heart. Then came the betrayal. I had been working on a small project for months, something I was genuinely proud of. It wasn't about money or recognition. It was about creating something meaningful for my own career, something I hoped might finally show Dad that I could succeed on my terms. I'd invited him over to see it, thinking maybe, just maybe, He could acknowledge my effort without judgment. I prepared a small presentation, walked him through every detail, and waited for even the smallest sign of approval. Dad's face remained unreadable for the first few minutes, which I took as cautious optimism. Then, out of nowhere, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, this is interesting, Elijah. But have you asked Ryan to look at it? He'd probably know what to do with something like this. Honestly, I think you might need his guidance." My stomach sank. I couldn't believe the words had come out of his mouth. I had poured months of work, late nights, and genuine effort into something I thought deserved acknowledgement, and Dad dismissed it in favor of Ryan's hypothetical involvement. I felt my face flush with frustration, but I stayed quiet, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Liam, seated next to me, looked up and whispered, "Why doesn't Grandpa ever say nice things about you?" I felt a lump in my throat that I could barely swallow. I wanted to say, "Because it's not about me, it's about him being a selfish man," but I knew that would confuse him and make him scared of family. I simply pulled him into my lap and whispered, "Sometimes people don't see the amazing things others do, but that doesn't make them any less amazing." After Dad left, I couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal. It wasn't just that he ignored my work. It was the pattern, the decades of this favoritism, the subtle, constant undermining that made me and my son feel less than in my own family's home. I realized that the breaking point wasn't some dramatic shout or argument. It was the slow accumulation of disrespect, the tiny cuts and comparisons that left scars you can't see until one day they erupt. That night, I paced the apartment, Liam asleep in his room, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. I wasn't going to let this continue. Not for me, and certainly not for Liam. I began thinking about ways to respond. Not with anger, not with screaming or public embarrassment, but with strategy. I wanted Dad to understand the impact of his actions without me stooping to his level. I wanted Ryan to see that privilege isn't permanent, that favoritism has consequences, and that every choice has a ripple effect. And I wanted Liam to witness that standing up for yourself doesn't always require confrontation, but it does require action. I spent the next few days quietly documenting interactions, noting every instance of favoritism, every backhanded compliment, every subtle dig. I watched Dad closely, noting his habits, his patterns, and the way he craved control and approval. Ryan, as always, remained oblivious, but his arrogance and entitlement made him predictable, and I realized that predictability was power. I just needed to wait for the right moment. It wasn't long before that moment presented itself, though I didn't know it yet. A family reunion was being planned for a few months out, and my parents were hosting it at their lake house. I received the invitation, and I could practically feel the storm looming. Dad had started subtly mentioning Ryan's contributions to the family, while barely acknowledging mine. My mind raced as I thought about the setup. The perfect combination of their pride in Ryan, my absence of recognition, and the presence of Liam, who now understood enough to feel slighted but too young to fight back. I knew the reunion would be the stage, and the confrontation, or the revenge, would have to be calculated. But even as I planned, the betrayal stung. This wasn't just favoritism. It was the message being sent to my son, that he, like his father, was less deserving. That was unacceptable. I promised myself that whatever happened next, I would not let history repeat itself. I would protect Liam, I would reclaim our dignity, and I would make sure Dad, and everyone else in that house, understood the consequences of underestimating me. After that birthday and the brunch incident, I felt like I was carrying a boulder on my back. Every interaction with my dad left me drained. Every phone call felt like a test I couldn't pass. For years, I had tried to prove myself, to earn a place in the family where I wasn't the punchline or the lesser son, and nothing had worked. It was exhausting, and I realized I was reaching a breaking point, not just emotionally, but mentally and physically. I felt like I had spent my whole life trying to please people who would never see me, and I was done being invisible. I spent a lot of that week in a daze, replaying every insult, every slight, every time Dad or Ryan had made me feel like a failure. I felt small, not just in their eyes, but in my own. Even Liam, the reason I tried to stay strong, noticed the weight I carried. One evening, as we sat in the living room playing with his little toy helicopter, the same one Dad had given him, I caught him staring at me quietly. "Dad," he said softly, "are you okay? You look sad." My chest tightened. I wanted to tell him the truth. That people you love can sometimes hurt you more than anyone else, and that not all family is safe. But I couldn't. Not yet. I just pulled him close, hugged him, and said, "I'm okay, buddy. Don't worry about me." That night, after Liam went to bed, I found myself scrolling through my old journals. I used to write everything down, from my childhood grievances to dreams for the future, but I had stopped a few years ago because I felt defeated. Reading my younger self, I realized I had forgotten how ambitious and determined I had been. Somewhere along the way, I had let my dad's constant criticism and Ryan's shadow dim my own light. I knew I had to reclaim it, not for Dad, not for Ryan, but for me and for Liam. The next day, I started small. I began organizing my finances, reviewing investments, and researching opportunities that I had previously dismissed because I thought I didn't have the talent or the resources. I had always been cautious, careful not to overreach like Dad would accuse me of, but now I realized that caution had been a cage. I started networking quietly, reaching out to old contacts, exploring side projects, and thinking about ways to build something of my own. I didn't tell anyone in my family, not Dad, not Ryan, not even my mom, because I didn't want their opinions or interference. This was my world, and I was taking it back. Liam became my little partner in all of this. He would sit next to me while I worked on spreadsheets, sometimes asking questions that showed more insight than I expected from a 7-year-old. "Dad," he said one evening, "why do they care so much about money and things? Isn't being happy enough?" His words hit me like a hammer. He didn't need a flashy watch or a fancy gift to feel valued. He just needed love, and he deserved a life where he wouldn't be measured against someone else. I promised myself that whatever I built, he would always know he was enough. Meanwhile, I started noticing subtle changes in myself. My confidence grew, not in a loud, showy way, but quietly. I felt capable again. I started getting small wins in my projects, clients appreciating my work, side ventures showing potential, and the satisfaction of seeing months of effort finally materializing into tangible results. It was intoxicating. I realized that success didn't have to come from validation from my family. I could create it on my own terms. Of course, the old feelings didn't disappear overnight. I still remembered every slight, every dismissive comment, and they still stung when I thought about them. But instead of letting them paralyze me, I started using them as fuel. Every time I heard my dad's voice in my head, "You're not like Ryan," or "You should learn to be content," I felt a flicker of determination. Not revenge yet, not in the sense of confrontation, but a quiet, simmering drive to prove that their narrow definitions of worth didn't apply to me. Then came the real test, a family gathering that I had no choice but to attend. Mom insisted, saying it was just a casual get-together, but I knew better. Dad would be there, and Ryan would be there, and I would be scrutinized, judged, and compared. I almost skipped it, but then I looked at Liam and realized this was a chance to show him that you don't let other people define your happiness. So we went. The evening started predictably. Dad immediately began praising Ryan's recent promotion, pointing out the smart investments Ryan had made, and dropping comments about how I should take notes. Ryan smiled smugly, clearly enjoying the spotlight. I felt a pang of old frustration, but this time I didn't react. I simply smiled at Liam, who was quietly playing with a puzzle I had brought along. I realized in that moment that I had more power than I had before. I controlled my own reaction, and I was determined to enjoy the evening on my terms, not theirs. What surprised me was how Dad responded to my calm. He seemed almost confused by it, like he was expecting me to fume or make a scene. He tried to needle me several times, bringing up my career, comparing our lifestyles, even making subtle digs about Liam's achievements. But I didn't bite. Instead, I started engaging in conversation with others, sharing ideas, joking with Liam, and generally exuding the confidence I had been quietly building over the past weeks. The more I did this, the more I noticed Dad's discomfort. He had built his identity around control and superiority, and here I was, quietly dismantling it by simply being unbothered, competent, and happy. By the end of the evening, I realized I had started something bigger than myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking under the weight of their judgment. I was standing firm, not by shouting or proving them wrong in their terms, but by creating my own path and thriving on it. Liam noticed too. He hugged me tightly on the drive home and said, "Dad, I like our family, but I like us more." His words were like a salve, healing old wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. The breaking point had passed, and the rise had begun. I had rebuilt myself quietly, carefully, and strategically. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, and I was doing it on my own terms. But I knew that the real test wasn't just personal success. It was about showing my family, in a way they couldn't ignore, that favoritism, manipulation, and entitlement had consequences. That part of the journey was still ahead. By the time the family reunion at the lake house rolled around, I felt like a different person. Not because I'd magically forgotten all the years of mistreatment, but because I had turned it into fuel. The slow, careful climb back to confidence had given me something Dad and Ryan had never anticipated: patience. I was no longer desperate for validation or acknowledgement. I had realized that the power they thought they had over me didn't exist outside their own walls. It was an illusion, maintained by my past willingness to let them dictate my self-worth. Now, I was ready to flip the script. I spent the weeks leading up to the reunion quietly gathering information. I started by observing patterns in Dad and Ryan's behavior, noting the moments when they were most smug, most self-assured, most careless. Those moments would become my leverage. I also reached out to a few extended family members, cousins and distant aunts who had always quietly witnessed the family dynamic but had never spoken up. They were sympathetic, some even frustrated with Dad and Ryan, and I gently encouraged them to document or recall past incidents of favoritism, hypocrisy, and manipulation. I didn't ask for confrontation. I asked for details, for stories that could be verified if I ever needed to use them strategically. Meanwhile, I continued building my career quietly but deliberately. I wasn't doing it for Dad or Ryan. I was doing it for myself and for Liam. But I knew the timing of certain achievements could become part of the plan. The more visible my success became, the more it would challenge the family's narrative that Ryan was the golden child and I was the less capable son. I didn't flaunt anything publicly, but I made sure that the right people, those who would be at the reunion, were aware of my progress. Subtle, understated, and effective. At the same time, I worked on Liam's confidence. I wanted him to see that we didn't need Dad's approval to feel valued. We talked about fairness, about kindness, about recognizing when someone is treating you unfairly. I taught him how to stand tall, to answer questions without fear, to smile when someone tries to diminish him. It was a slow, steady process, but by the time the reunion came, I could see it paying off. Liam was more self-assured, more aware, and far less likely to internalize the toxic patterns that had shaped my own childhood. When the day of the reunion finally arrived, I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The lake house was bustling with extended family, all unaware that beneath the surface, something was quietly brewing. Dad and Ryan were already there, as expected, already in their familiar roles. Dad narrating Ryan's achievements to anyone who would listen, Ryan laughing at his father's jokes and basking in approval. The dynamic hadn't changed externally, but I could sense cracks, subtle fissures in the facade that I planned to exploit. I didn't confront anyone immediately. That wasn't the plan. Instead, I positioned myself as calm, composed, and competent. The observer, the quiet presence who had returned not with neediness or insecurity, but with clarity and direction. I mingled with relatives, catching up casually, smiling at Liam when he ran past me with a toy boat he had found in the lake. I could feel Dad glancing my way repeatedly, his brows knitting together in subtle frustration. I imagined he was asking himself, why isn't he flustered? Why isn't he reacting? And I relished it quietly. He didn't realize that calm wasn't weakness, it was preparation. Over the next few hours, I began executing the first pieces of my setup. I had strategically placed subtle reminders of my achievements where family members could see them without me drawing attention. My portfolio was casually displayed on my laptop while I spoke with my cousins. Liam's school awards were laid out in the living room on a shelf, and a few of my small business accomplishments were mentioned in casual conversation, framed as advice I recently gave someone. Nothing flashy, nothing overt, just carefully designed evidence that I was capable, accomplished, and entirely independent of Dad's validation. I also cultivated allies quietly. Cousins who had always been wary of Ryan's arrogance now leaned in when I spoke, nodding knowingly at my observations about Dad's favoritism, without me ever framing it as attack. Aunt Muriel, who had been quietly critical of Dad's obsession with appearances, gave me a knowing glance that told me she understood exactly what I was doing. I was building a network, not an army, but a subtle web of witnesses and supporters who would lend credibility to what I planned. The tension began to mount as the evening wore on. Ryan was predictably oblivious, running through stories of his triumphs, showing off his expensive watch and talking about Dad's recent praise. Dad, of course, continued to beam with pride, clearly basking in the reflection of his successful son. But every now and then, I caught his glance toward me, sharp and searching. He couldn't understand why I wasn't visibly deflated, why Liam was laughing and enjoying himself, and why I seemed utterly unbothered by the favoritism that had defined our family for decades. Those glances were tiny victories in themselves. Then came the moment I had been quietly anticipating, the perfect opportunity. Ryan, in a rare lapse of awareness, made a remark about how Dad had always guided him to success, implying that anyone else without Dad's influence was doomed to fail. The room chuckled politely, but I leaned in slightly, just close enough for a few nearby relatives to hear. It's interesting, I said lightly, because I've been doing quite well on my own, without needing guidance. I didn't raise my voice or sound defensive. I simply stated it, casual and unthreatening. A few relatives looked up, eyebrows raised. Dad's jaw tightened. Ryan's grin faltered ever so slightly. It was subtle, but it was a crack. From there, I let the tension simmer. I didn't have to force confrontations. I allowed the small moments to accumulate, like a slow tide rising. I shared an anecdote about Liam's school project and my own guidance, framing it in a way that showed competency and pride without aggression. I engaged other relatives in conversation, letting them witness the contrast between my calm, confident demeanor and the showy, performative arrogance of Ryan. Every interaction was a calculated step, a building block in the eventual revelation of years of favoritism and neglect. Even Liam played his part in this subtle setup, though of course, he didn't realize it. He ran up to me proudly, showing me the tiny boat he had finished painting, and I praised him sincerely in front of everyone. That's incredible, Liam. Look at how much care you put into this, I said. Dad, of course, made a small comment about how Ryan had done something bigger at that age, but Liam, buoyed by my praise, didn't shrink. He smiled, held up his boat, and said proudly, "But Dad, mine floats really well." The room chuckled at his innocence, and I could see Dad's frustration barely contained behind his polite exterior. By the time dinner was over, I had successfully set the stage. I wasn't openly confronting Dad or Ryan yet, but I had shifted the atmosphere. The subtle seeds of awareness were planted. Relatives had seen my success, Liam's confidence, and my composure. Dad's control over the narrative was weakening, even if he didn't fully realize it. Ryan was unsettled, just enough to make him more reactive in the future. I had created conditions that would allow the eventual revelation, the confrontation, to hit with maximum impact. Driving home that night, Liam chattered about the day, excited about the lake and the boat he had painted. I felt a mix of pride and anticipation. The plan was in motion, carefully crafted and quietly executed. I had built my strength, gathered subtle allies, and positioned myself to reclaim what had been denied to me for decades. The next step was to pull everything together, to strike at the heart of the favoritism and entitlement that had plagued our family, and to do so in a way that was unmistakable but undeniably strategic. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was gathering, and when it hit, there would be no denying the consequences of their years of neglect and favoritism. I had the patience, the knowledge, and the quiet power to turn the tables completely. All that was left was to wait for the perfect moment to reveal it, to let the carefully constructed setup unfold, and to ensure that when the family saw what I had built, not just for me, but for Liam, it would be impossible to dismiss, ignore, or belittle. And I knew, deep down, that when that moment came, the impact would be profound. Not just for Dad and Ryan, but for the rest of the family, and most importantly, for me and Liam. We had weathered years of judgment, neglect, and favoritism, but we were no longer the same people. We had risen, and now it was time to strike. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, almost unremarkably, but I knew better. It wasn't fireworks or shouting that would make them see. It was precision, patience, and timing. The setting was another family gathering, this one under the pretense of a casual dinner at Dad's house. But I had spent weeks planning every detail. I wasn't going in with anger or emotion. I was going in with proof, confidence, and a strategy that would leave them no room to deflect or gaslight. Liam was my shadow throughout, but for the first time, he wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the revelation. He had grown so confident, so unshakable, that I knew even Dad's subtle digs wouldn't faze him. That gave me strength. From the moment we arrived, Dad and Ryan were already in their usual positions. Dad hovering in the kitchen, overseeing the meal as though his approval alone could dictate happiness, and Ryan lounging in the living room, phone in hand, half listening, half explaining some minor accomplishment as though it mattered more than anyone else's. I greeted them politely, offered a hug to Dad, and smiled warmly at Ryan. There was a flicker of annoyance in Dad's eyes when he realized I wasn't flustered by his performative pride. That flicker was the first small victory. I waited until dinner was over. I didn't want to be rushed, and I didn't want anyone to feel like they could interrupt or derail what I had carefully constructed. I had set the stage. Cousins, aunts, and uncles had been subtly briefed in prior conversations. Some of them had been witnesses to the decades of favoritism and neglect, and they were ready to support what I was about to reveal. I simply asked for everyone's attention, my voice calm, steady, unshakable. Before we finish tonight, I want to share something. I began, making eye contact with Dad and Ryan. For years, my son and I have observed a certain pattern in this family. It's subtle, so subtle that it often goes unnoticed by some, but it's there. And I think it's time it's acknowledged, once and for all. I let the pause linger, letting the weight of my words sink in. Dad's face tightened, and Ryan's grin wavered. I had them right where I wanted. I started with small, factual examples, birthday incidents, brunches, minor gifts, subtle favoritism, and offhand remarks that had been part of our lives for decades. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I simply presented evidence. On my last birthday, I said, my son was given a plastic toy, while Ryan received a $1,500 watch. That wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I could see Dad shift uncomfortably, like he wanted to interrupt, but I held the floor. I spoke calmly about how those patterns affected me, and more importantly, how they affected Liam. I spoke about the insecurity, the self-doubt, and the years of feeling like I was invisible. Then I did something subtle, but powerful. I turned the focus toward Liam, holding up the tiny boat he had painted, a boat he was so proud of, and smiled. This is something my son created entirely on his own. He's 7. Do you see the care, the thought, the effort? Yet he was dismissed with a toy meant to imply contentment. That's not guidance. That's judgment. And it's a pattern I won't allow to continue. I felt the room tense. Some relatives were staring quietly, nodding, while others, like Aunt Muriel, looked shocked at the clarity and courage in my words. I could see the realization dawning on Dad. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the narrative. He wasn't the center of approval or admiration. He was being confronted with the truth in a way he couldn't redirect or spin. Ryan, ever confident, started to protest, but I raised a hand. It's not about you defending your achievements, Ryan. It's about acknowledging the harm that favoritism and entitlement can cause, and understanding that those of us who were ignored or dismissed aren't invisible anymore. Then came the final, quiet blow. I revealed some of the progress I had made, my career milestones, the business projects, the clients I had quietly worked with, the financial independence I had achieved without any of Dad's help or approval. I framed it not as boasting, but as undeniable proof that the old narrative, that I was somehow lacking or inferior, was false. I had built something strong, capable, and independent, and they couldn't argue against it. Cousins and relatives murmured quietly, some nodding, others exchanging looks that suggested they had noticed but had never dared to voice it. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of Liam proudly holding his boat, smiling at me. That was my secret weapon, the presence of someone who had been the intended target of years of neglect, now thriving, now proud, now unshakable. Dad tried to regain control, stammering about Ryan's guidance and how we just wanted what was best, but his words fell flat. The truth was right there in front of him, undeniable and calm, delivered with patience, dignity, and strategy. I ended with the strongest statement I could make. We are not second best. We are not invisible. And from now on, the way we are treated will reflect respect and fairness, or it will not be tolerated. I let the weight of that sink in, and then I smiled, reached down to take Liam's hand, and added, "We've spent long enough waiting for change. Now we create it ourselves." The fallout was immediate. Dad's jaw was tight, his pride visibly bruised, his usual authority evaporated under the clarity of my words. Ryan sat frozen, clearly shocked that I had grown so strong and that the room had subtly turned against the old hierarchy. The relatives who had witnessed years of favoritism now understood, and some quietly offered nods or supportive murmurs, reinforcing my position without me needing to push further. I didn't need loud arguments or public shaming. The quiet, undeniable truth did all the work. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the family shifted dramatically. Dad tried a few half-hearted attempts to assert his authority or regain control, but they fell flat. The relatives who had quietly supported me continued to recognize and validate my achievements and autonomy. Ryan, ever arrogant, seemed unsure how to navigate the new dynamic. He had relied on Dad's approval and favoritism for decades, and now the foundation of that system had been shaken. I didn't rub it in. I didn't need to. I had made my point, and it was permanent. Best of all, Liam thrived. He saw firsthand that fairness, respect, and acknowledgement weren't privileges reserved for the favored. They were earned by confidence, effort, and integrity. He smiled at me one evening, holding up his tiny boat again, and said, "Dad, I think we're going to be okay." And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe it. Weeks later, Dad called me. His voice was quieter this time, lacking the usual self-assuredness. "Elijah," he said, almost choked with emotion, we were wrong about you. About all of you." I listened calmly, but I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The point had already been made. My calm, strategic approach had forced acknowledgement without theatrics, and that was far more satisfying than any argument or confrontation. I ended the call simply, "I know, Dad, and we'll see what happens from here." No anger, no bitterness, just quiet strength. That was my final move, the confirmation that I had reclaimed control of my own life, my family's respect, and most importantly, Liam's sense of security and self-worth. The old hierarchy was gone. The favoritism, the entitlement, the subtle cruelties, they had all been exposed and neutralized. I hadn't needed to lash out, yell, or create drama. I had simply been patient, deliberate, and unwavering. And now, for the first time in decades, I felt free. I looked at Liam as we sat in the quiet living room one evening, and he grinned up at me. "Dad, we're really okay, right?" I smiled back, holding his small hand in mine. "Yeah, buddy, we're more than okay. We're stronger than ever." And in that moment, I realized that the best revenge had never been about hurting anyone else. It had been about proving to myself, and to my son, that we were worth more than anyone else's judgment. The lesson was permanent, the power reclaimed, and the future ours to shape. The storm had passed. The reckoning was complete. And the last words I carried in my mind as I watched my son sleep peacefully were simple, undeniable, and infinitely satisfying. We had won, not by anger, not by retaliation, but by patience, strategy, and unwavering self-worth.